Yeah, I was looking all over, Facebook and stuff, and seeing things like the white genocide people, and more, and it's not. I mean, there's problems with the term white genocide. It's a very lame phrase. It's not working. What's happening is that they've succeeded in getting a bunch of people on the internet to go around and post white genocide. But the problem is that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take off because that concept has no currency, right? You're not giving a mimetic vehicle for something that people already believe or want to believe. Okay. Something like that, except with the phrase, black genocide, would gain more ground. Even though there's no truth to that concept at all. If you said something about, like, Africa being colonially exploited, look at some pictures of some blacks who got killed, this is black genocide, right? Same thing with the Gaza thing, right? If you said, look at what Israel's doing, I mean, they killed like 1,000 people in a few air raids or something, which is horrible. Okay, if one of those 1,000 people is one of your kids, I mean, that's I'm not here to say that it's not a bad thing, but I am here to say that it's not genocide. But of course, it's much more easy to say that that's genocide. If you said, Israel is conducting genocide against the Palestinians, that gains ground with far less effort than saying something about white genocide. Right? And so these little memes or whatever aren't going to work. And they work for a similar reason that they work for. Excuse me. These little memes aren't going to work in advancing alternative ideas in the same way, for the same reason that comedians are inherently not subversive, right? Because in order to tell a funny joke that the audience is going to get and the audience is going to laugh at, right, it requires irony, often. Right? It requires a twist, but a twist that is based on assumptions that the audience has. And so when you're making political humor, you're making twists based on, you're saying funny things, making twists based on what the audience believes. Like, you could make jokes about there not being WMDs in Iraq. Okay? You couldn't very easily make jokes about there actually being WMDs in Iraq because of what people believe. Now, as it turns out, there probably were WMDs in Iraq, right? Because we know during the invasions there are large shipments, trucks, with liquid containers shipped off into Syria. We now know Syria has been using sarin gas, and not it's not only like sarin gas, but it's a particular type of gas that could only have been made in a certain period of time. And this corresponds with the chemical shipments that Iraq was getting from Germany. And there's no known evidence of Syria actually producing these gases. So they're pretty confident that these were made in Iraq and then shipped to Syria when the United States started invading. So Saddam Hussein probably did in fact have these weapons of mass destruction or whatever, as they were called. Now, I don't think that's reason to go invade Iraq, but Saddam Hussein did in fact probably have weapons of mass destruction. But you couldn't very well get up on, do some stand-up comedy and make a joke about Saddam Hussein actually having weapons of mass destruction, because all the audience believed he did not, right? And so if you were to try to subvert the idea, the idea being that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction, if you were to try to subvert that, you couldn't do that with comedy, because comedy relies on what the audience already believes, and to try to make a joke out of that. Okay, you can only make jokes out of what the audience already knows. Okay, you can't make a joke about what they don't know. Okay, in order to make a joke, you have to operate in their reality, and you're twisting things around, you're cross connecting things in a way that's ironic and funny. Okay, you're dealing in their world. Okay, but subversion means going up to them and saying your world is shit. Okay, your world is a bunch of crap. Okay, and that's not funny. When you go around, making a whole bunch of memes, when you like a little quip, the thing is, when you say something really quick, there has to be something underlying that, right? There has to be beliefs underlying that. For example, when you say, Israeli genocide, well, just the phrase, Israel's committing genocide, that's a meme that a lot of people are going to repeat, but they're only going to repeat it if they believe the underlying idea. Okay? If they don't believe the underlying idea, repeating a meme is not going to go anywhere because people aren't convinced by bumper stickers. They're convinced by arguments to a lesser extent, but primarily what their social circles believe and what perceived authorities say. Okay? I mean, people aren't persuaded by bumper sticker slogans. They're persuaded by arguments and what the perceived authorities say, right? And so the thing about the Palestinian genocide, why people can just say there's a genocide against the Palestinians, and then dipshits are going to repeat that meme. Okay, the reason that works is because there's a big old backswing, right? And the backswing involved what did professor say, what did their social circle say, what did their selected media outlets say. Okay, there's that whole massive backswing, and this meme, this is Israel's committing genocide against the Palestinians, right, which is transparently false, right? This takes off. Okay, and so I'm looking at what like these white genocide people are doing, saying, anti-racist is just code for anti-white. Okay, what they're just doing by saying that is kind of like a meme. They're not latching on to stuff that most people believe. There are a few people who believe that, right? Who do in the back of their mind kind of thought that anti-racist is a code for anti-white. But they just never really verbalized it, and when someone comes out and actually says it like that in kind of a bumper sticker slogan, it's like, you're putting words to what I've been thinking this whole time. And there's a few people who do think that, but most don't, which is why this is not going to work. Okay? And one thing that you find if you actually start to argue with, self-proclaimed leftists a lot is just how integrated their beliefs are. Okay? Like, which is why the deconstruction has to be complete. When you say, for example, how do I put this? If you want to talk about, say, race differences, biological race differences, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to dispel, because what they're going to do is they're going to go, this is like what the old scientific racialists said, which was this caricatured, brutish idea that every single white person was leaps and bounds smarter than every single black person. They believed that that black people could never, these people in the past believed that not a single black person could ever learn how to do addition because they came into contact with some primitive tribes who did not know addition. Right? That's the level of straw man not even straw man, just completely, airman view they have of the old scientific racialists. They don't recognize that the views of the old scientific racialists are basically the views are very close to the views of people who believe in human evolution today, right? And so here's what they're thinking. They're thinking this is what the old scientific racialists believe. What you're saying may be more sophisticated than that, but it's basically just a reaction to the criticisms leveled by the good guys. Okay, that's what they think. Okay, so before you can even begin to talk about race, you need to clarify what the old scientific racialists said, which was actually a lot more sophisticated and much more reasonable than these people imagine it to be, right? And you have to go and if you want to talk about brain size, okay, now you have to go back to Gould. They're going to say, well, Gould, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now you got to go back and deconstruct that, right? They want to say, and if they want to say, preempt you with, oh, you're saying the reason Europe conquered the world is because of biological differences. Well, here's what Guns, Germs, and Steel said, right? Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to make a distinction between gross, grand civilizational differences, right, as one issue versus things like, income gaps within countries, right? So you have to draw that distinction. And there's so much stuff that you have to do. Right? So much stuff that has to be deconstructed. You have to do the backswing. All this stuff with just go out and say anti-racist is code for anti-white over and over and over again. It'll be like frickin' it'll be like this psychic driving thing. Psychic driving doesn't work. Okay, the reasons, so what these people who say speak in slogans, speak in super simplistic terms that other people will understand. Okay, all this does, it's cargo cult stuff, right? The cargo cult were these people in Papua New Guinea who saw U.S. troops land there, and they built airstrips, and airplanes started coming in and delivering all sorts of what they called cargo, which is basically all the stuff of civilization: canned food, shirts, building materials, magazines, cigarettes, alcohol, stuff they called cargo. Okay, and so these people thought, if we build an airstrip, cargo, these planes that just materialize from the sky, apparently, that will come down and land at us, and they'll start giving us cargo. That's what they imagined. Right? And that's what the cargo cult was. They saw, oh, look at this airstrip. If we build this airstrip, these airplanes will come in and start delivering us cargo. Right? And that's kind of what these, white genocide people are like. They're thinking, if we, put forth these memes and put forth this kind of comedy, then they'll start believing what we believe in the same way that they believe what liberal comedians say, or what quote-unquote liberal meme pushers, slogan pushers say. No, the reason they laugh at liberal comedy and glob on to what liberal meme pushers say is because of the giant backswing. And that's what you need. You need a big old backswing. Okay? Right? You need the whole infrastructure of thought. Right? You need the whole infrastructure that causes the plane to come in to an island out in the middle of nowhere, right? It's not going to come there just because there's a runway there. There's a whole other thing going on, right? And so, in that sense, these white genocide people, they're kind of like the Papua New Guinean cargo cult. So, but of course, how do you do that? Well, it's much easier to do that now than it is to do than it was to do, say, 10 years ago, quite frankly. 10 years ago, because what was 10 years ago was 2004. Right? That's before quote-unquote Web 2.0. That's like, when was YouTube founded? I don't know when YouTube was founded. But even like things, this was back in a time when like things like eBaum's World was like really big. Where you had video sharing sites, but it wasn't quite the social media as we know it today. So, things have hugely changed. Um, and radical ideologies of all types are having explosive growth. Now, it's explosive growth from a very low starting level, so it's still not anywhere possibly challenging, the status quo or whatever. But it is, more than it has been in a very long time. But while specifically radical ideologies haven't taken off, what has taken a big pounding is institutions, and that's something that polling data shows that general faith in institutions, general faith in the university has gone down. It's still very high. Faith in the media has gone way down. That's very important. That's very valuable. Faith in government has gone down. Faith in Congress has gone down. So faith in big institutions have all gone down very heavily in the United States from, say, the 1980s. That's a very good thing, and that's something that can be globbed onto. That's something that can help, right? So the fact, and so the failure, or at least the lack of the declining trust in popular or authoritative institutions opens the door to heterodox ideas. Or does it? Well, here's what I'll say. A lot of ideas from Christianity that came about because of Christianity have outlasted the church. And I would say basically the idea of soul equality before God, the idea of equality between peoples, the idea of certain. I don't want to get into that, but I would say that, for example, the Christian influence on the Western world has outlived trust in the Catholic Church. Right? People who don't trust the Catholic Church still have Christian morals that have continued to exist beyond the power of the church. And I think in the same way, and there's lots of words for it. You can call it cultural Marxism. You can call it social justice. You can call it political correctness. Or you can call it just treating people with respect or whatever. I mean, you can call it all sorts of things. But this thing, which is pejoratively called political correctness, which is more positively called social justice, whatever it is, it has outlived faith in the media and faith in the universities that have created it. Right? Media and the universities, we could say that this is where it came from. Now there may be a little bit of debate about that, but I'd say that generally it starts in the universities, filters out through the media and through activists directly, in kind of the pseudo media of academic meetups and activists and presentations that the intellectual set, the quote unquote intellectual set, like to go see. It filters out in this way. But the thing is that the ideas pushed by the universities and the media and the pseudo university, this kind of these middle ground thing, like TED Talks, for example, I would say is like a middle thing. It's not quite university, and it's not quite MSNBC, CNN, hack news media. Right? I guess we'll call it the hack media. Things like the New York Times, things like Newsweek, things like USA Today, things like Fox News as well. All right? Fox News is kind of an odd duck because it leans quote unquote right, or what passes as right wing today. Okay, but generally, we call that the hack media. Then we have this sort of pseudo media, things like TED Talks, things like, the, I don't know what you call it, I forget what it was. It was something in Switzerland where they had a whole bunch of people send in their dumb ideas to change the world. The Davos question thing, things like that. Like how that's kind of like a middle ground between being hack media and the university, and then you have the university itself, right? And they're all dumb. They're all dumb in their own way. They're all stupid. They're all breathtakingly vapid. And I think more and more people are starting to recognize that they're all vapid. They're all very vapid things, and that's something that not only do people sort of believe, and they believe it in a vague way, but because they believe it in a vague way, that's something that's very easy to strengthen when you show them the facts about it. When you show them, for example, okay, you say, like, for example, a university historian is supposed to be an expert in history. Well, how do you know? Like, the way you know that, for example, a chemist is an expert in chemistry is because he does things. Okay, he does things that work. Okay. But if, like, okay, so a historian, what objective test, what does a historian do to show you that he knows something about history? Or to take economics. Okay, so you're an economist, so predict the economy. You say you're an expert on the economy, predict the economy. Right? And predict it better than, X number, amateurs. That's what you do is you take like 100 economists and 100 amateurs, and you have them make predictions of objective things, objective like market metrics, like what's the stock market going to be, blah 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 blah. And okay, economists aren't stock traders; they're not specific, but okay, they'll make general economic trends. Okay, is there going to be a recession in 4 years or whatever, or within a certain band? Let the economists do like really big picture prediction. Don't demand them to pick stocks or whatever, because that's not their specialty. Fine, all right. Right. I think the fact that economists aren't good at stock picking is something of is a bit of a knock on them. Like, I mean, that is economic stuff. Okay, and well, they can't pick that because that's not the scope of their discipline. Okay, well, I think that's a little bit of a strike against them, right? And they can say, well, that's not the scope of our discipline, and I would say, exactly, that's kind of a strike against you, that it's not even in the scope of your discipline. You can't do that. Okay, but anyway, that aside, and have them make long-term predictions. But of course, to an extent, well, first off, it's generally known that they don't make better like long-term predictions than laymen. One, but two, there's a lack of those things, and there's a lack of interest in those things. There's a lack of wanting to do those things. And saying, to what extent is a quote-unquote economist even an expert at anything at all? Right? And you could do a similar thing like, does a doctor make a better diagnosis on a patient than a patient using WebMD? A doctor with all his expertise versus a patient using WebMD. Well, who makes better diagnoses? I've read some things that say it's about the same. Okay, so then to what extent is a doctor an expert in diagnosing illness? Now you could say, well, maybe a surgeon knows how to do surgical procedures. Okay, but here's the question though: like if an amateur with access to WebMD, can make diagnostic predictions with about as much accuracy as a doctor with access to WebMD. Well, fuck. To what extent is the doctor, do we say that the doctor's even an expert? You say, oh, he's an expert because he has X degree. Well, how do you know that X degree means anything if he can't predict any better than, right? How do you know this business major, right? Did people who have these business majors run better businesses than people who don't have business majors? Now you could say that maybe they do, because you have to have a certain level of cognitive abilities to go through college and to get a business major, right? To jump through all those hoops demonstrates an ability. But I mean, let's say you controlled for IQ and perseveranceness. Like, what is the business major degree, going to provide you? Now you could say that you know you could say that, well, the tests haven't been done, so you can't definitively say that a business major does not make you better at running a business. Well, fuck all. Like, you have all these people spending all this money, spending years of their lives getting these business majors. Well, where's the fact that there hasn't even been a test? It speaks to a certain kind of mindlessness of the whole thing, right? And you can say this about so many so-called experts, right? And let's say you have an expert in, okay, what's sociology? Make some predictions, right? You say you're an expert, let's hear some predictions and let's compare that to some predictions made by, and moreover, what I want to, and when you frame it in that way, you can then say, okay, let's go back to predictions regarding civil rights. Okay, the old racists said it wasn't going to work, blacks weren't going to integrate. There wasn't going to be any narrowing of the income any more than what would occur based on the economic rise of the South. For example, yes, there has been a significant narrowing of the black-white income gap since 1950, but once you control for the narrowing of the income gap between the South and the rest of the U.S., that all goes away. Okay, so basically the fact that blacks live in the South and the South has been economically rising explains the narrowing of the black-white income gap. Okay, civil rights didn't do jack shit, and so the old racists were predicting exactly that, right? The old racists who were predicting that, okay, you bring in, these Africans from Africa into Finland, okay, they're going to behave just like the blacks in the U.S. do. Right? And people in Finland would go, no. See, we're not bigoted like the Americans. They'll integrate just fine, right? The reason the blacks in America aren't integrating is because of the racist whites of America. Okay, but in reality, the blacks in Finland behave like the blacks in the United States, which is consistent with a biological explanation of the racial differences, which is consistent with the biological explanation of the differences in behavior. Okay. So you want to say that the people who were supporting immigration and predicted that integration would occur, that they're the experts on immigration policy and the results of immigration, well, what the hell? Then what does expert even mean? Like, you have all these goddamn experts who can't fucking predict. Okay, so I'm getting kind of far afield here. But what I'm getting at is that that's an argument that I have made that's compelling to people who don't share any of my other views. And so that's the first thing you need to do, is you need to deconstruct authorities and you need to deconstruct experts. And what this does is this thrusts them into a world of uncertainty, because no longer can they rely on the universities. Right? Because basically you go in and you deconstruct every category of experts that the university produces, except for a few of the hard sciences, right? Because why? Why would the hard sciences be different than the soft quote unquote sciences, the social quote unquote sciences? Why would it be? Well, because these people face a very close razor of objective judgment. Either the bridge stands or it falls. Either the rocket shoots up or it doesn't. Let's say you have someone who has an economic theory. Is there going to be a direct empirical test of it in the same way that there's going to be a direct empirical test of whether or not the rocket flies up? No, there's not. Okay? The most you could say is that there could be sort of a test for the past 50 years. But the thing is, there's always going to be so many other outside variables that you can always blame it on something else. So it's not a direct obvious test in the way that there is in fields like physics or chemistry, except on the fringes, right? When you start getting into that which is debatable in physics and chemistry, that's different. But guess what? That's different. Okay, and that is recognized as different, right? When you get into high-level theoretical physics, that's where you get into, a gray area, and it's taught as a gray area, right? It's not taught as, that which is the correct thing to believe, right? It's not taught as anything else. It doesn't masquerade as a science, whereas history does masquerade as being, if not scientific, something that is objective, like something that is like there is a true form of history. For example, this idea that the Ku Klux Klan, disproportionately lynched blacks because they were black, or that whites in the United States had a prejudice against blacks on the basis of them being black, right? Whereas, and there's stuff which goes against this, right? You could say, for example, there were cities in the North that free blacks went to, blacks who earned their freedom somehow. They would go and they would go into the North, and these blacks would be initially disliked, right, because of some prejudice against blacks. But over time, these blacks in these northern cities, for example, like Detroit, Chicago, right, Harlem, New York, they would, in time, be accepted as, as upstanding citizens of their community. Right now, they were still black, and there were still, laws against race mixing, but otherwise, they were accepted as, responsible citizens of the United States. That like the white people. Which made sense because their literacy rates were similar to that of whites. Their educational results were similar to that of whites. Their incomes were similar to that of whites. They were basically, across the board, statistically speaking, on the level of the whites around them. Right? Of course, there were slight differences, and there's always going to be slight differences between different subsets or whatever. And as a result of this, they were viewed. And Thomas Sowell actually goes into this in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. He goes into how there are polls on people in these cities who would who polled that they had a positive view of them. They said they had a positive view of them. There are subjective anecdotes of the time about describing that the whites in New York had a positive view of the blacks in Harlem, or at least about as positive as they had of other whites around them. Economically and in terms of socioeconomic status professions, the blacks were proportionately represented, right? So basically what you had was a bunch of blacks who acted like white people. And as a result, they were treated like white people. Not right away, but in about 6 months they were. Okay? And so this idea that blacks are viewed negatively because of, it's just because of the way they look. No, they're viewed negatively. Whites have a negative view of them, right? Because of the content of their character. Okay, it's not because of the way they look. And you could say that, implicit associations, whites have a, immediate negative reaction to that person. Well, guess what? You have an immediate negative reaction to an ugly person as well. And black people are kind of ugly compared to white people by my subjective evaluation. So when you see an ugly person, boom, right in front of you, well, you're going to have a negative reaction. And if you try to do word association between positive and negative words, well, you're going to more quickly associate negative sounding words to ugly faces than to good looking faces. Right? And black faces are uglier. Okay? And you could say, well, that's racial prejudice. Well, fine, whatever. Okay, but that doesn't what does that mean? Okay, anyway, But that's just one of these myths, and that's one of these myths that's pushed around. Oh, black people are discriminated against because they're black. Well, that's probably not true, right? And you see all these other groups that are initially discriminated against because they are because there's preconceptions about what the Chinese are like, but as soon as the Chinese, through their behavior, show that they're not, as the crude stereotypes painted them out to be, views on the Chinaman shifted. Right? He was found to be a very kind person. He was found to be a very, they were found to be honest. They were found to be very intelligent. They were found to be very shiftful, very, very diligent. And those views persisted. Right? Originally, it was believed that Chinese people were stupid, and they were treated as if they were stupid. In fact, there was this guy, and there was an Onion guy who, news reporter from the Onion, who had an Asian intern, and he kept talking to this Asian girl in very slow sentences, and was and complimented this Asian girl for doing very simple tasks as if she was super stupid. But that kind of reflects a view of East Asian people that white people had. It reflects a view of East Asian people that white people had before they had regular contact with East Asian people. As soon as they began to have more contact with East Asian people, those views evaporated. Right? Just as white people in northern cities had negative preconceptions of blacks when those blacks moved in, initially by the subjective evaluations, they were treated negatively and viewed negatively. But as soon as these blacks show themselves, these free blacks show themselves to be, behaviorally like white people, those negative preconceptions evaporated. It wasn't until general emancipation that you got a wider cross-section of these slaves being emancipated and then basically let loose into northern cities that negative views of blacks came to be. Why? Because a whole bunch of black slaves who weren't able to earn their freedom moved up north and behaved as blacks do today. Okay? Right? And I would say that today you have almost an opposite thing. You have whites having a preconception that blacks are actually normal people, just like them. You scratch the surface and underneath there's going to be a white person. It's just that their environment and the way they're treated puts them in difficult situations. Okay? And so white people who live in places like Massachusetts or Wisconsin or Minnesota, white people who don't have regular contact with black people are going to believe that. And so they're going to have more positive views of blacks, which is in a very general sense, probably proxied by support for the Democrat Party and support for Barack Obama. Whereas white people who have more regular contact with black people, right, white people down in the Deep South, or white people who have more regular contact with mestizos, white people, in Texas, in Arizona, in Southern California, okay, tend to have more negative evaluations of those people. Right? Because the positive stereotypes evaporated as they had real contact with these people. Right? And this confirms my personal experience, which is that, when I personally went out to move from Kansas to Los Angeles, originally I had positive views of mestizos. That all went away when I had real contact with what they really were like, which is, and I don't have a particularly high opinion of white people, but it's definitely higher than that of mestizos now. Okay, it didn't used to be the case. I used to have a higher view of mestizos than I did of white people, because my views of mestizos came from television, right? And it came from Republican talking points. It came from what the Republicans said about mestizos as being God-fearing, hard-working, people who just want to be Americans. And I found that that's not the case when I actually came into contact with them. And looking at real data, I found that that's not the case. So what you have amongst the view of white people regarding other races is that white people's view of other races changes very quickly when they actually have contact with them to a more accurate view of them, right? When you had white people in, say, New York, and freed slaves who earned their freedom, not slaves who were emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation, but slaves who earned their freedom before that, came to New York. These were blacks who were behaviorally like white people, okay? These were the kinds of blacks who were able to earn their freedom, right? Which is not an easy task. So there's kind of a selection bias. There's a filter. They were the ones who were able to get through. They earned their freedom. They went up to New York. The whites of New York, initially, before these blacks came, had kind of a negative view of blacks, right? Based on how blacks were purported to behave, based on how, whites in the South portrayed them, right? And how did whites in the South portray blacks? They portrayed blacks based on how slaves behaved, okay? And so that's kind of a negative view, and so that view filtered up north, and so whites in the North believe that. Okay, but then some blacks came in, a non-representative sample of blacks came in. Okay, an elite sample of blacks came into Harlem. The whites then changed their view of blacks in general based on what these Harlem blacks were like, based on what these blacks who earned their freedom were like. And they thought, oh, well, these blacks are just like us. They're demographically indistinguishable from us, and they had a much more positive view of them, right? But then as soon as the rest of the blacks, a more broader cross-section of blacks, a more broader cross-section, all the blacks, not just the elite, but all the blacks in general started moving north, then whites' views of blacks went back down, right? So what you're seeing is that whites' views of these people, of these races, corresponds to how these races actually are. Okay, originally they had some false preconceptions of what the Chinaman was like, but over time, based on actual experience with Chinamen, their views of the Chinaman began to more and more reflect how East Asians actually are. Same thing with Irish. Now you could say Irish are white people, but it's functionally kind of the same story. You had non-Irish white people having all sorts of preconceptions of what Irish people are like. But as Irish came into the U.S. and as other groups of white people came into regular contact with Irish people, they found that Irish people were basically like them. And so all these anti-Irish stereotypes, to the extent they even existed in the first place, evaporated. And that's what happens. That's what happens with racial prejudice among white people, is that as they come into contact with other races, any inaccurate preconceptions go away. And more accurate conceptions, post-conceptions, are formed. Okay? The reason that white people have a negative view of black people today is because black people behave in negative ways. Right? When whites come into contact with blacks who behave like white people, those white people treat them like white people. Okay? Evidence of this is Harlem before the Emancipation Proclamation. It's Detroit before the Emancipation Proclamation, where you have these populations of black people that behave like white people. Okay? These black people who behave like white people were treated like white people. It was a natural experiment. Right? And this was in the bad old days when white people supposedly had all sorts of horrible prejudices against black people. Right? But this kind of shows that that's a myth, right? A myth, the myth of white prejudice. That's what it is. That's what I'll call it. It's the myth of white prejudice, right? But see, that's just one thing I'm talking about right here. And so if you want to talk about race, there's all these little things that you have to go into, and you have to deconstruct it from the top down. You can't do cargo cult stuff. Right? And you can't do comedy, right? Because comedy, I've already been over this, and I don't want to loop over that again, but it's so deep and it's so integrated, and that's why I'm writing this book, and that's why this book is taking such a long time, for two reasons. One is I like to goof off and do other things, but two is that there's so much stuff that you need to do, and it's not just that there's a lot of content to write about. If it was just if my only goal was to write and cover the content, then I would have been done a long time ago. But the thing is, I have to write and cover the content in a way that people will continue listening, and in a way that deconstructs it in a way that the reader won't blow their gourd. Okay? Let me put it this way. If I started this with the section, all right, let's start with my theory of why the races differ in IQ biologically with reference to the impact of agriculture in their evolutionary history. If I started with that, they would blow their gourd, right? Because they don't accept, because there's all sorts of underlying premises, right, regarding theories of history, right, about slavery, about colonialism, right? They believe Jared Diamond's bullshit. Right, Jared Diamond. Africa doesn't have, proper soil to have proper agriculture. Look, it's full of forests and trees. Right, and of course, South Africa can't support crops. Look at the soil. Meanwhile, Boers come in and have no problem growing crops. Right, some British farmers go up into Rhodesia, and Rhodesia ends up being like one of the biggest grain exporters in the world. Okay, right. And it's more funny, like Africa can't grow crops because it doesn't have the right soil and it's full of jungles. Meanwhile, rice was originally like in Africa and then spread around to Asia and stuff. Like there was rice farming in Africa in like 3000 BC. Okay, and more Jared Diamond stuff. And what's funny is that, in all throughout Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond goes over the lack of domesticatable animals in Africa. And the reason we know this is because the animals in Africa weren't domesticated. Right? It's beautiful, really, quite frankly. Right? We know that the zebra wasn't domesticatable. Right? And the way we know this is because the zebra was not domesticated by the blacks who were there. and you think I'm joking? You think Jared Diamond is more sophisticated than that? Well, then give me the reasoning as to why the zebra was not domesticatable, whereas I forget the name of the animal that the modern domestic horse was domesticated from. But tell me why the animal that the modern day horse was not domesticated from, was domesticatable. Like tell me the difference between the two, right? But and Jared Diamond doesn't. He just kind of said it's just like the zebra was not domesticatable because it wasn't domesticated, and that's basically the extent of it, right? And the soil in Africa doesn't support crops. Meanwhile, European white people show up to Africa and they have no problem farming. Right? So it's like, and it's funny. You think, well, see, Europe's full of white people and they have all sorts of farming stuff. And Jared Diamond goes, see, the environment of Europe is great for farming. Let me ask you another question. How much farming was going on in North America before white people showed up? A little bit. There were some Native Americans, especially in the Ohio Valley, who had some peach tree crops and stuff, but it was minor. It was very small scale. Okay, so there was a little bit, but there was very little. Kind of like Africa. Kind of like black Africa. But then the white people show up, and all of a sudden there's all sorts of farming in North America. Well, that sounds a lot like the Boers showing up in South Africa. That sounds a lot like, the British showing up in Rhodesia. Right? Suddenly white people show up and there's all sorts of farming. And now we're supposed to, and it's so It's so silly. Like you could say, well, the Europeans had better farming technology. Did they? Did the Boers? What did they have? Did the Boers have all sorts of special fertilizers? What did they have? Yeah. So, but anyway, I get on all sorts of little tangents. Maybe some people find it interesting, these little tangents or whatever. But really, ultimately, what I just want to say is that in order to promote a a truly heterodox view of the world, not something that's like super mainstream, that says things that people don't believe, but things that are safe. Like, for example, you could say that you support, you know, let me put it this way. You could say something like, I support worker-run syndicate economy, a worker-run syndicalist economy. And that's something that most people don't support and most people don't believe in, okay? But it's safe to say you support it. You can safely say that you support this, but it's not going to get you in trouble because, you know, what people will respond to is saying that, well, that's kind of a nice ideal, but I don't think practically it could work. So you can advocate worker syndicates safely, right? It's a safe thing. It's not truly subversive. It's something that most people don't support because they, on a practical level, don't think it can work. But it's not something that they find morally offensive, right? Whereas racial separatism is something that people find morally offensive, okay? It is subversive on a moral level. It is truly subversive, okay? Truly subversive things are not fun, okay? Truly subversive things, right? Like George Carlin, for example, right? The reason, here's how you know George Carlin never said anything truly subversive, okay? He was popular. Okay, that's how you know. Okay, or he was a stand-up, like that's another thing. You could say he was a stand-up comedian. Okay, so now you know that he never said anything truly subversive, right? If he's a stand-up comedian, he's not saying anything truly subversive. Okay, and if you can say something in like a bumper sticker slogan like anti-racism is code for anti-white, or what they're saying, what they're advocating is white genocide, if you can say something in a bumper sticker slogan and have a whole bunch of people agree with you and have a whole bunch of people saying, you know, you put words to what I was thinking but couldn't verbalize, right? If you gain a lot of traction with a bunch of bumper sticker slogans, or you gain a whole lot of traction with political humor based on your political beliefs, then what you're doing is not actually subversive, right? And if what you're doing is subversive, none of that's going to work, because all that is just the plane coming in onto the tarmac, okay? That's all it is. And so if you're thinking that, well, what we need to do is we need to have the kind of bumper sticker slogans and the kind of comedy that these people do, and then the planes will come in. Well, that's, you know, it's the same kind of error that the Papua New Guineans, when they start erecting little towers and they clear out a little, you know, landing strip and have little torch lights along the quote unquote runway and start waving, you know, fire sticks, kind of like the glow batons that the guys at the airport have. You know, they start doing that little dance, thinking that the airplane's going to come in. It's not going to work. Okay, the airplane's not going to come in, because the reason the airplane was coming in on the other tarmacs that actually work is because they have a whole backswing. They have cultural currency. Okay, a whole backswing, and that's what I'm trying to do with my book here, is the backswing. Okay, I want to write a book that is a bullet. Right? This is the bullet book. The title is Now Comes the Hard Part. Right? And that's a good title because it's a grabber title. People go, now comes the hard part. Ooh. But people want to hear that. They want to hear what the hard part is. Okay? And it's the backswing. It deconstructs everything. It deconstructs slavery. Right? The idea that slaves had it bad off comparatively in the world. Right, the idea that slaves were economically exploited. You know, oh look, a slave got whipped. Well, guess what? Conscripts in the army got whipped. Okay, lords were allowed to whip their peasants. Okay? Right. Well, and also you could say, well, to what extent is the life of a slave different than the life of a, serf in Russia or a serf in Poland? Okay. Oh, look, let's compare the heights of black slaves in the U.S. to various white populations in Europe and in the United States. Let's compare the life expectancy of black slaves versus... Oh, look, black slaves in the U.S. actually live longer than white people in Boston. And it's those kinds of things that that I'm going to have to deconstruct, right? Or how there or accounts of black people who recalled a social status in the South of the white plantation owners at the top, white politicians and plantation owners at the top, blacks in the middle, and poor whites at the bottom. Right? And they even had a song, called "I'd Rather Be a Nigger Than a Poor White Man." Right? And this is a song that blacks would sing. Right? I'd rather be a nigger than a poor. Anyway. And there's all sorts of stuff to deconstruct. It's huge. There's a whole theory of history that you have to deconstruct. There's a whole theory of what slavery was like that you have to deconstruct. The lynching myth. And the lynching myth is very easy to deconstruct, and it's not that these things are hard to deconstruct on any kind of factual level, but it's a whole backswing that you have to go through, right? And you also have to deconstruct their authorities completely. You have to shatter them. Now, to a degree, today, big authorities and big institutions have fallen on hard times, and you'd have to be kind of a muppet to not think that it's primarily to do with the internet, because the collapse in faith in major institutions corresponds just too closely with the rise of the internet for it to be any kind of coincidence. But for whatever reason, polls show that faith in institutions are down, and that's great. And so what I do at the beginning of the book is I smash it, I shatter it. People have lack of faith in the universities, and that's good. The thin end of the wedge is already in, and what I do is I just hammer it home. Right? I hammer it home by saying, for example, oh, you think that peer review works? Well, here are these guys who are able to make up gibberish studies, and they're able to send it into journals. Not just any journals, some of the most highly regarded journals. They're able to make computer-generated research papers, and they're able to get in. Not only are they able to get in, but they're able to get in ahead of real research papers. Right? That is, there's a review panel reviewing these papers that pick their paper, which is just a bunch of gibberish that they strung together, jargon gibberish that they strung together. Right? And so I go over that. I go over, researchers and their overly honest methods. It's a Twitter hashtag, but it's basically a bunch of real researchers, making light of a lot of the, methods that they use in doing their research, which is, and I look at these overly honest methods, and for me, I'm not shocked at them at all, at one bit, nor do I think it invalidates their research. Right? What you have is a bunch of namby-pambies who don't understand how real science is done and don't have any tolerance for uncertainty. They think that science means certainty. Okay? They think they look at these research methods that don't control for everything that they think needs to be controlled for, and they call it overly honest methods. Well, you can't control for anything, and maybe you just need to have a little bit more tolerance for uncertainty and come to conclusions with a little bit less evidence. Okay, that's the way I see it. I also look at the lack of replicability, about how 3/4 of published, research published in journals is failed to be replicated, right? And that's the hard science, right? And so that's what I do. I really focus on attacking the hard science, because here's what people know. People know that the hard science is infinitely more rigorous than the quote-unquote soft science. So if I can beat up the hard science in a systematic way, right, and really shatter that, and then say, oh, on the other hand, here's the soft science is like bullshit compared to this. Right? Compared to overly honest methods, compared to 3/4 can't be replicated, compared to, auto papers getting into journals, right? Compared to this circus, and add to that historical examples of kind of the walk of shame, kind of the reaction that geologists had to plate tectonics, right? That militant uniformitarians had to the Burt's formations, all sorts of stuff like that, right? And say this is the hard science, right? This is the kind of circus that occurs in the hard science, okay? Once you do that, it is generally known that the soft science is nowhere near even that. So if you can shatter faith in the hard science. Now, when I say shatter faith in the hard science, I don't mean shatter faith in science itself. I mean shatter faith in scientists. Shatter faith in authorities. Basically say, look, you can't trust these guys just because they're accredited scientists, okay? Now, maybe you can trust a person because he's an honest person who knows what he's doing, who's making good arguments. Maybe you can. I know there are people like that, okay? But what I'm saying is that you can't say, look, this is a study that comes from blah 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 blah, blah university by Mr. Perferdurf with a burper D's as accreditation. Therefore, right? That's what I'm saying, right? And so it shatters their faith. Basically says all you can trust is your own wits. All you can trust is your own ability to argue the argument itself. And once you shatter all of this, then by the time you start getting into stuff like race, what are they going to do? They're going to say, well, what you say about race is wrong because why? Because of slavery? Already dealt with that. Because of the lynching myth? Because white people are inherently prejudiced against blacks? Already dealt with that. Oh, because Perferdurf at the university because of some guy in the soft sciences dealt with that? Get out of here. Right? Oh, because of some guy in the hard sciences dealt with that? Well, that's a bit suspect. Because I've already, drove that wedge in. And the reason I can drive that wedge in is not because I'm a brilliant orator. You could drive that wedge in yourself, right? You could shatter it yourself, okay? Anyone could do that if they spent the amount of time that I've done. It's not a special ability on my part. All I'm doing is I'm exploiting a bias, an anti-authority, an anti-institution bias that people in the United States have. I am in a sense exploiting the spirit of the age to break down the barriers to radical ideas, to then set up my own backswing in a single place. And it has to be in a single place, right? You can't say, let's make one video on the topic of lynching. Let's make one video on the topic of this, that. No, it's total, right? What they have is a total ideology. You can call it cultural Marxism, or you can call it political correctness, or you can call it social justice, or you can call it just treating people, blah, blah, right? Whatever you want to call this thing, right? I call it universitarianism because it's the belief held by the elites in the universities, right? And so I think that's why you should call it universitarian, not universitarianism like in the Christian bullshit, whatever that is, but universitarianism as in the beliefs that come from the universities. I think that's the clearest way to say what it is, because that's in a sense that's what it is, okay? Because there's all sorts of inconsistencies, like black nationalism good, white nationalism bad, okay? and the MRAs have found all sorts of inconsistencies as well. But the only consistency there is that it is the set of beliefs that come from the universities. Okay, that is the most objective label you can apply to it. Okay, so that's why I call it universitarianism. Okay, and given that this stuff comes from that universitarianism comes from the universities, break down the universities, break down faith and experts, and then suddenly what do these people have? Right? Because if you shatter all of that, then what do they have to do? They have to argue the argument. They have to depend on their own wits. And so when the scientific racialists come at them and say, okay, here's the arguments, they can't, what are they going to do? Are they going to, after you have just shattered their faith and authorities, you have just shattered all of that. And so now they go, and so that's typically what they want to do. What they want to do is they want to go, oh, but authorities, please come to me. Scientists, please save me with your reassuring words that evolution stopped at the neck. Right? That's what they want to do. But if you've broken all that down, they can't do that in a way that convinces themselves, because that's what this is about. It's about self-convincing. Okay, that's why they reach out to the university. That's why they reach out to the words of Neil deGrasse Tyson. Okay, that's why they do that, because it's convincing to them. But if you shatter their authority, then they can't, in a self-convincing way, just appeal to some scientist to say what they want to hear. Because why? Because it's just because they know that they're not evaluating the arguments on their own ground. They're just taking the word of it because he's an expert scientist, blah, 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 blah. Right? But if you've completely wrecked that, then they can't do that. And so what they have to do is they have to deal with your arguments on race directly, with their own wits. And as soon as they start doing that, as soon as someone starts doing that, they tend to come towards my way of thinking, in my personal experience. Maybe that's confirmation bias. Maybe that's confirmation bias. But that's what I think, and that's the reasoning behind this. That's why you have to have a bullet. That's why you have to have an all-encompassing thing, right? Because let's say you do a video on the lynching myth. Okay, maybe someone will hear the lynching myth. Maybe they'll believe it, maybe they won't. They probably won't believe it, and the reason they won't believe it is because they'll go, well, this guy's a racist. He says a bunch of facts, but these facts are probably wrong because experts in the universities disagree with them, right? So, i.e., they still have that foundation of authority that they are invoking when they please, okay? Even though the spirit of the age is anti-authority, okay? So before you can make the lynching myth argument, you have to use that spirit of the age, which is anti-authority and anti-university. You have to use that thin end of the wedge that's already there and hammer it in and completely shatter it, so that by the time you come around to making, for example, the lynching myth argument, they can't, in a self-convincing way, appeal back to the authority.